contrast is I'm not limiting myself to hitting Hezbollah and Hamas. I'm going after the mothership, the Islamic Republic. Now that Israel is taking the fight to Iran, is it sustainable? Is it in the national interest of Iran to continue being where it has been for so long on the issue of Israel?
Over the past month, Iran and its regional network of allies and proxies, the so-called Axis of Resistance, has suffered a string of dramatic losses and defeats, from the beeper and walkie-talkie attacks that maimed or killed hundreds of Hezbollah operatives, to the killings of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and Hamas head Yahya Sinwar, to assassinations of IRGC commanders in Damascus and Beirut. The Axis appears to be on the back foot. Meanwhile, the region is waiting for Israel's promised retaliatory strike against Iran itself. Some analysts have begun to ask whether the Axis of Resistance will survive the wars in Lebanon and Gaza. But are the triumphalist narratives about the Israeli military efforts premature? What is the future of the Axis and its members, and what can the US and its allies do to confront and disrupt this Iranian-led network? In the second part of our special two-part episode on the future of the Axis of Resistance, I speak with a pair of MEI Iran experts who discuss Iran's role in keeping this network together and the conflicting interests that could force Tehran to rethink its antagonistic regional proxy strategy. I'm joined by Alex Vatanka and Meir Javedanfar. Alex is the director of MEI's Iran program, while Meir is an Iranian-Israeli lecturer, author, and commentator, as well as an MEI non-resident scholar. Thank you both for coming on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Meir, first question to you. The common wisdom we're often hearing these days is that Iran and its Axis of Resistance are on the back foot, particularly since Israel's devastating strikes against Hezbollah and the IRGC inside of Lebanon. But how do officials and experts in Tehran assess the strategic situation Iran finds itself in?
From what I can see, there's, first of all, overall, the Iranian leadership is projecting a message of strength. It's projecting a message that it's not on the back foot, that what has happened is temporary, and that the Axis of Resistance will continue. And its demand for end of the war, a ceasefire in Gaza, being the only demand to end the war in Lebanon, still remains. That the killing of Hassan Nasrallah has not changed Iran's demands for a ceasefire in Lebanon. At the same time, I think internally there's a lot of discussion regarding how Iran got here, to the point where, according to New York Times, Israel assassinated Haniyeh in Tehran and it killed Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut and quite possibly his successor. There were rumors circulating regarding the fate of IRGC commander Qahani. There was a report in television yesterday, but in Iranian television, some people are casting doubt whether that was actually a recent image of him, and he did not speak. But nevertheless, the fact that he disappeared off radar for 2 weeks also led to some questions. And I think the Iranian concern until recently was that Israel was not respecting Iran's red lines, that Israel was doing anything it pleased because Iran was not retaliating against Israeli operations against Iranians in the Middle East, Iran's allies in the Middle East, and officials inside Iran. Hence why they undertook the recent missile attack against the state of Israel. And the impression in Iran is that that was the right thing to do, and that Iran has established deterrence. And from now going forward, Iran not only has to warn Israel against retaliation, against taking any steps against the Iranian nuclear program, oil fields, gas fields, and its military infrastructure, it also has to include the United States. And this is something that's very interesting, I'm finding, that they are now threatening, some of the hardliners are threatening the US.
Alex, turning to you, how is the Iranian regime's response to the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah impacting the internal stability of the Axis of Resistance? And how is it impacting domestic stability and resilience of the Islamic Republic's regime?
Matt, on both counts, I have to admit, we just don't know enough. There isn't enough material here to say whether the Israelis have done in Lebanon is shaking the axis of resistance to its core, whether it's making the regime in Tehran rethink its foreign policy going forward from here onwards. But to Meir's point, there's certainly a debate in Iran for the simple reason that this whole idea of axis of resistance, forward defense, is conceived as a way of fighting Iran's wars outside of the homeland, away from Iran's borders and its territory. And for a long time, that worked essentially. Certainly, if you look post 2003, what the pro-Iran groups were able to do in Iraq, they were able to, bog the United States down. So from Iran's point of view, that was good. The United States never really seriously contemplated punishing or responding to Iran by going after the mothership, the Islamic Republic, if you will. It limited itself essentially to those Iraqi groups that were hitting U.S. forces during the time the United States military was operating in that country. So that, if you could look at that as one example of how Iran's axis of resistance has fared, the contrast is what Israel is doing today. The contrast is, I'm not limiting myself to hitting Hezbollah and Hamas. I'm going after the mothership, the Islamic Republic. And that, I think, is the reason why you have to assume there has to be much more serious debating going on inside the Iranian regime about whether this is sustainable. Now that Israel is taking the fight to Iran, is it sustainable? Is it in the national interest of Iran to continue being where it has been for so long on the issue of Israel? And let me just wrap up by saying this. End of the day, Iran's position on Israel is essentially one of an ideological choice. Iran can look for other ways to help the Palestinian cause other than sponsoring and spreading the axis of resistance model, which is basically what Iran has done. And now they're finally sensing that maybe the cost benefit analysis for them is changing. And as I said, they could choose to go in a slightly or very different direction going forward, because they've never come to this point of having to actually go to war for defending this model of fighting Israel and Israel's main ally, United States.
Alex, sticking with you for just a moment more on this question of resourcing, can Iran afford its confrontational regional foreign policy that's based on supporting these proxy militant groups? And do you think that this Axis strategy will actually outlive Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei?
Look, this is the big question. I think it's all relative. Iran is paying huge amounts in terms of direct costs, but even bigger sums of money in the damage Iran is willing to pay by essentially becoming a pariah state. When you are sanctioned as a result of your regional policies, the way Iran is today, those sanctions mean that your economy is going to suffer, that the foreign investors are not coming in. There will be a brain drain from Iran to the rest of the world. Capital is fleeing Iran and so forth. So there are different ways you can measure the cost of Iran being behind acts of resistance. And it's certainly going to be a significant amount of money going forward because it already has billions of dollars. But Matt, another way of looking at your question is, does it stop the acts of resistance tomorrow? And I think the answer to that is most likely no. One, these operations by and large are relatively inexpensive, if you will. The missiles, the rockets, the drones, yes, they do cost plenty, but they're not enough to sort of bring the Iranian economy down on its knees, at least not in the short term. And remember, some of these Iranian proxies, certainly the ones operating in Iraq, they have their own source of funds as well. They're in the government in Iraq, and Hezbollah is part of the system in Lebanon. Whatever money there is in some of these places where Iran operates, they will also have access to funds that are not necessarily coming from Iran itself. So I would just say the way I will look at this issue is, in the short term, they can pay for it. The question is, are they willing to pay the huge cost to continue the course going forward, literally maybe years or perhaps even longer to come?
Meir, Iran obviously sees the Axis and especially Hezbollah as perhaps its most important deterrent against Israel. But if the Axis were to break apart, if it was significantly weakened, as it seems to be for the moment at least, will that be enough to push the Iranian leadership to pursue nuclear weapons instead as a more ultimate deterrent?
That's certainly one of the psychological operations that the Islamic Republic is undertaking in order to deter Israel from attacking Iran. Until about a year and a half ago, it was anybody who said anything positive about the advantages of making a nuclear weapon was censored in Iran. There was a very strong censor in place. Anybody, any site, any website, any official who said, no, it's good to have a nuclear weapon, we should make a nuclear bomb, was censored in Iran. But suddenly we're hearing it, and recently it has reached a crescendo. And I think the Islamic Republic is using this to warn Israel that if you push us too far, we may use this as an option. So be very careful how you approach us. I think the question of making a nuclear weapon is very much related, at least partly related, to Iran's future policies. In Iran, there's huge fight within the different factions. It's a question of regarding what to do in the region. It's a question of ideology, but also I think economic considerations play a huge part. As big as ideology, if not more. There are certain factions within the regime, within the armed forces and the intelligence services, who want to have a slice of the defense budget. They want to justify their existence, Iran's drone and missile industry, running the Quds Force, running Iran's extraterritorial operations for economic considerations, because they make a living from it. That's the way they get a slice of the Iranian budget. And I think they are going to fight for every penny in the future, and they're going to continue financing these operations because their economic livelihood also depends on it. Their position in the regime also depends on it. And I think they're going to continue with supporting the axis of resistance, even if the war between Iran and Israel turns into a much more intense war. Iran's policies counterproductive for Iranian national interests? Of course they are. I think you see this from the majority of the people of Iran. But this is an intra-factional fighting. These people know that Ayatollah Khamenei has a very strong ideological position against the state of Israel, and these people try to exploit it in order to serve their own economic interests. And they're going to continue with supporting the axis of resistance, and they're going to continue working with the nuclear program, because that's another way for them to maintain their position within the Islamic Republic of Iran. Whether Iran will ultimately make a nuclear weapon will depend on the perception that if it does do that, will Israel and America attack? And I think they realize that Israel and America will attack. I think the fact that Israel was able to reach Mr. Nasrallah so deep in the ground, 83 tons of bombs were used to get to Mr. Nasrallah. First, the number of bombs were used in order to punch a hole in the ground, and then other bombs followed it. 83 tons was dropped to kill him. And I think that message was that if we can reach Nasrallah so deep behind the ground in Dahiya, in the Zahiya neighborhood in Beirut, we can also get to Iran's nuclear program.
Final question to each of you. Iran is obviously central in supporting all of the members of the Axis of Resistance, and Tehran places strategic importance in maintaining the Axis as a tool of deterrence and regional leverage. So given this reality, what can or should the US and its allies do to splinter or undermine this network? Meir, if you could go first.
Oh, that's an excellent question. I wish I could say, Matthew, that there was a way for Israel to find a third party to reach a deal with Iran, to say, okay, well, let's demark this situation. You keep your forces so much, so many kilometers from our border in Lebanon, so many kilometers from our border in Syria, and we won't attack you. But there is no such third party. The Russians would have been able to play this part, but since the Ukraine war, it's no longer there. The Russians don't have the credibility on the international scale to do it. Israel would never ask the Russians, especially after the Ukraine war, because our American and our European allies would be furious, and rightly so. So the only other way Israel has at its disposal is to continue fighting these groups. They are not going, there is no other way. Israel does not have the diplomacy option. if the next president in the United States, whoever he or she is, can use Iran's weakness to reach a nuclear deal, to get a good nuclear deal, to restrict the threats posed by Iran's nuclear program, then as it's said in Arabic, ahlan wa sahlan. But regarding other issues, I just don't see a way forward. What concerns me, Matthew and Alex, is that as somebody who's been following this issue for 19 years in Israel, more and more I hear it in the press and in academic circles that people are reaching the conclusion that Naftali Bennett's octopus doctrine is the way to go. Is that we've been putting too much emphasis on Iran's proxies and not enough on Iran. And that's the best way in the long term to reduce Iran's policies in this region, which are so detrimental to the lives of Israelis and Jews around the world. At this point, there's the question of Palestinian peace process with the Palestinians always comes up. I wish I could tell you that reaching peace with the Palestinians would solve this issue, but we tried that during Oslo I and Oslo II, and we saw that one of the biggest enemies of peace was actually Iran's support for groups that killed Israelis, and they are the ones who torpedoed Oslo I and Oslo II. And so unfortunately, that's not going to reduce Iran's impact. In fact, many Israelis who want to make peace with the Palestinians, I hear it more and more, realize that we won't be able to do it as long as the Iranian regime is continuing to support these groups. And the consensus in Israel seems to be sooner or later we're going to have to get into a war with the Islamic Republic in order to resolve the threats that it poses. We should move away from attacking its 10 tentacles of the octopus. We should go for the octopus's head. That way, the Iranians will pay a price. The Khamenei regime, of course, will pay a direct price, thus making it more likely that it would change its strategic calculus. And also, by doing that, that would be the best long-term way to reduce its support for these proxy groups. Because as far as Israelis can see, Iran is ready to fight Israel to the last Arab. So we should reverse this proxy model. And if the Iranians see that they are forced into fighting for their proxies, then this whole model will cease to be profitable for the Iranians, because the whole reason you want proxies is so that they pay the price, not you. Once you start paying a price for your proxy, then the whole subcontracting model no longer makes sense.
And Alex, last word to you. Will the axis of resistance survive the war in Lebanon? Does it matter? And if the answer is yes to both questions, then how can the US and its regional partners confront and keep the axis and Iran off balance going forward?
So Matt, very quickly on the first part, look, I don't know how long Israel's going to stay going up in Lebanon. You look at some of the most prominent Israeli leaders of the past, but it's Begin 78 signing the Camp David Accords, but it's Ehud Barak pulling out of Lebanon as prime minister in 2000. Ehud Barak being one of the most prominent, celebrated Israeli military men of all time, or Ariel Sharon pulling out of Gaza in 2005. Some of Israel's most prominent, celebrated military men, or right-wingers, if you will, have in the past, in our lifetime, decided that there wasn't a military option and they pulled away. But I hear what Meir is saying. It might be different this time because there's a very large country of almost 90 million called Iran, Islamic Republic, that is hell-bent on squeezing Israel and continues to do so. And maybe the Israelis have come to this conclusion that, they just can't. For them, this isn't a luxury problem. This is an existential problem. And they need to at least give Iran a choice, a tough choice to make a decision. Is this fight worth fighting? Because that's essentially what I think Israelis right now have decided to do. Matt, in terms of your question of what the United States can do, two things right away jump at me when I hear that question. What can the U.S. do to weaken the axis of resistance and the Islamic Republic, the mothership? The first reality for us to recognize is the U.S. doesn't have a policy towards Iran as such, nor does it necessarily have a vision for the future of the Middle East. It just doesn't exist. The U.S. deals with one file after another, depending on what needs to be managed and when to avoid crisis from getting bigger. We've seen that in the last year plenty of times. But there is no one vision for the Middle East going forward, right? And that's a problem. The thing that we have to remember on the Iranian side, on the axis of resistance, and this sort of links to the issue of US options. And this is also something that links to what Meir was saying earlier about the fate of the Palestinians. Look, absolutely, Iran, not while Ali Khamenei is alive, is going to want to sit down and have a diplomatic conversation with Israel. That's not going to happen. But that doesn't need to happen for us to be able to hope for some progress. What needs to happen is for Israel to do something meaningful, serious on the Palestinian issue, really believe again, once again, as a society, as a country, that there is a Palestinian neighbor that a dialogue needs to be had with. And if that happens, you're not going to eliminate the threat of Iran, but what you're going to do, which I think is very important, you're going to reduce Iran's ability to recruit in the Arab world for the axis of resistance. Because the Islamic Republic of Iran has never been able to walk into a country with its message if that country was at peace and they adopted Iran's narrative. When Iran has succeeded, it's when it walks into countries that are in chaos, where there's a security vacuum. Lebanon, early 80s, or the Houthis of Yemen the last 10 years. That's how they became a proxy of Iran, if you will. And the same is true for Hamas. Hamas, for the longest time, Sheikh Yassin the founder of Hamas, didn't have much time for Iran. But out of necessity, this generation of Hamas leaders that came turned to Iran. They didn't have anybody else to turn to. So you want to squeeze the options that Iran has in the region. So the axis of resistance, the militancy, that dark Islamist militant worldview, which I find to be dark, doesn't find fertile ground. And that's something the United States can do. It's a major undertaking. You need to operate in so many different countries, and you need to invest intellectually, financially, diplomatically. You need to go out there, work with your partner countries, be it Egypt, the Gulf states, others, to it doesn't have to be on a military front. The last few years, we've heard so much about military coalitions against Iran. That perhaps is also needed, but you need something more to, fight back against Iran's narrative that the only way for peace in the Middle East is to fight Israel to a standstill. That's the Iranian message. You need to counter that. And you do that by really creating the conditions for a proper diplomatic track to come about on the issue of solving the Palestinian problem. You do that, you've done a major job at undermining the Islamic Republic's regional agenda.
Can I comment quickly?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I have to agree and disagree with my friend Alex. First and foremost, we have some policies that are very negative, settlement expansions. Of course, we see some of the terrible attacks that have taken place against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. All these must cease. The lawlessness, the way some settlers behave. We must try to reach understanding for now. After October 7th, reaching a talking two-state solutions is very, very far away now. We now have to talk about reconstruction and first and foremost living together. That's the most realistic scenario, and Israel must do that, and Israel must take responsibility, and of course, so do the Palestinians. But where I disagree with Alex is that if we even reach a milestone, that's not going to change Iran's attitude and strength in the Middle East. Why? Because the regime doesn't only rely on the Palestinian issue when it walks into countries in order to get support. It walks into countries that are failed. It uses the factional differences in the country to exploit, to set one against the other. It also has a very strong anti-American message. It's not just an anti-Israeli message, it's also an anti-American message. And it also develops very strong economic interests in some of these countries where it has influence. And I think even if we reach a deal with the Palestinians over two states, even if the optimal solution happens, optimal scenario is realized, I don't think that's going to stop Iran. I think they're going to continue supporting all these groups, all these nasty groups, because actually peace will make it very, very dangerous for them.
This is where we'll have to leave the debate. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank both of my guests, our listeners for tuning in, as well as MEI's podcast producer, Elliot Sanders, for all his work on this latest episode. Please read, listen to, and watch all of our coverage on Iran and security issues throughout the Middle East region on our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Matthew Czekaj, and I invite you to listen again next time.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.